Welcome everyone around the world. Welcome to all my subscribers. This will be a nice short video because I only have one verse to read. That's the whole point of how I'm doing this. With one single verse, I will prove, with no room for any argument, I will utterly prove that Christianity teaches that we are under law. Okay? A lot of people are very confused about the matter of law in the Bible. A lot of churches are confused on that, but I'm keeping it to one verse for this video here. It will prove that we are under law. After I read the verse, I'll give a few minutes of, you know, explaining what I meant by the churches and others being confused, right? Because a lot of denominations, I don't know the actual percentage, but I would say over half of Christians believe that we're not under law, right? So like 1 point something billion Christians, 1.1, 1.2 billion Christians think that we're not under law, but just grace. In fact, when I went to look for the thumbnail image for this video, to look for one for this video, all I typed in was, two words like God, what is it? No, I typed in like under God's law or something like that. But like every single image, all the like, I don't know, 100 images, like every single one except for like one or actually I don't even think there was one that said the contrary. Like that's why I found a neutral one of a gavel in front of the earth, right? Every single one says we're not under law but grace or something to that extent. So clearly people are very confused about this, because what does the Bible actually teach? I could prove it all right here from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This will be undeniable. And the hilarious part is that this verse is being said by Paul. And even in Christianity, and outside of it, but even in Christianity, you have a division where some people, not a majority, but some people believe that Paul was a false apostle and they believe that he perverted what Jesus taught. That's a minority, but there's a good chunk of people that believe that. Probably millions. I would say easily millions. Probably tens of millions. Maybe 100 million Christians that believe that. But I think most people outside Christianity believe that as well. Like Judaism is always, all the rabbis are always saying that, right? So a lot of people think that Paul is the one responsible for teaching that the law is dead and gone. And that's where you get the division in Christianity, because some either agree with that or disagree with that. You see what I mean? The ironic thing is, I have a verse by Paul here, one of like 35 that he says, but here is a verse by Paul from his own mouth where he clearly shows that the law is in effect. And of all the other 30-something verses that I've shared before, I put in my book, theology book, and all that, this one here has always escaped my attention to share with others. This one is so beautiful. It's nestled in amidst the rocks, right? And it's like shining gold, like an ore of shining gold. So I'm going to start reading from verse 14 to just help lay in the context, right? In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 14, it says, "So also did the Lord direct to those proclaiming the good news of the good news to live. And I have used none of these things, neither did I write these things that it may be done so in my case. For it is good for me rather to die, than that anyone may make my glorying void." So Paul is all about spreading the gospel, the good news, right, in order to live. And he didn't want that gospel, the gospel that he was glorifying, to be made void, right? In verse 16 he says, "For if I may proclaim good news, it is no glorying for me, for necessity is laid upon me. And woe is to me if I may not proclaim good news." So again, he's really stressing that he is here to preach the gospel. That's why I'm reading these verses, because it's going to show you I'm not taking this one verse out of context. It has a well laid out context that Paul is talking about him reinforcing the gospel, right? And it says, "Woe is to me if I may not proclaim the good news. For if willing I do this, I have a reward. And if unwillingly, with a stewardship I have been entrusted. What then is my reward? That proclaiming good news without charge, I shall make the good news of the Christ, not to abuse my authority in the good news." Now, this is where it starts getting interesting. That was to lay down the context, right? Verse 19, "For being free from all men, to all men I made myself servant, that the more I might gain. When he says for being free from all men, he means he's not actually a slave to anybody. He's a free man, right? So he says for being free from all men. So even though I am not a slave, he says to men, to all men, I have made myself as a slave. That's a famous Christian statement, be a servant unto everybody. That's true love. You know what I mean? Not actually go become somebody's slave, but be as a servant, be kind, help them do things for them without asking for anything. You know what I mean? That's what it means to serve and to be a servant in that context, right? So he says, even though I wasn't a slave, he says, to all men I made myself servant, that the more I might gain. Now pay attention. Verse 20. And I became to the Jews as a Jew. Now Paul testified elsewhere to clarify that he was a Jew. Okay? So, Rabbi Tovia Singer tries to say, oh, this is proof that Paul faked being a Jew. No, that's just ridiculous. Listen to the whole, portion of this chapter, right? He says, and I became to the Jews as a Jew, the Jews I might gain. And why would this be? Because through Christianity, Jews are commanded to keep Judaism. Christians and all other Gentiles are commanded, Acts 15, Acts 21, to keep the Gentile law. And the two commands from Jesus, which are, which encapsulate all other law. Any law that would be from God can be encapsulated within the first two commands that Jesus dictated. Loving God and loving everybody else. Okay? So when Paul's saying, make myself a servant to everybody else, he's fulfilling that one there, right? So he says, I became to the Jews as a Jew. That means when he was around the Jews, preaching to the Jews, he was doing it in a Jewish way, Judaism. Matthew 5, where Jesus said the law is eternal. That's not for Gentiles, it's for Jews, right? So I became to the Jews as a Jew, the Jews I might gain. And to those under law, as under law, that those under law I might gain. Now, this verse and the next verse usually breeze over everybody's head. But I'll read it from verse 20 again. Now pay attention, right? Understanding all the context I just gave. All the build-up that Paul has made here, right? He's spreading the gospel, how important it is to do so. When he's spreading the gospel to Jews, he's doing it as a Jew. To those under law, as under law, that those under law I might gain. And in verse 21, to those without law, which represented the Gentiles back then, okay? To those without law, as, this is the key part, as without law. Not being without law to God, but within law to Christ, that I might gain those without law. So Paul has just said, I go to Jews as Jews. I go to those under law, meaning Gentiles who have, because Paul says elsewhere, there are non-Jews, there are Gentiles in the world who don't have a law from God, given from God, but they have a law from God, law of God in their heart. Just like how Abraham I discerned that himself, Paul makes mention of that. He says, those with law are judged by law. Those without law, he has a whole area where he talks about that. But notice where he says, I came to Jews as a Jew. I came to those under law as under law, right? So when he went to more righteous Gentiles who were living more righteously, he came like that. And then verse 21, this is the clincher. To those without law, that means the nations that didn't have law from God or the law of God in their heart, which would be the Gentile law that should be inspired from the Holy Spirit within naturally, right? Unless you shut it out. He says, to those without law, as without law. That's the key right there. So Paul, I'll drill it in for everybody again. This is what I mean. It will blow over everybody's head because Paul writes so eloquently, right? But listen, he said, I came to Jews as a Jew, that I might gain them. I came to those who are under law. So I came to Gentiles who are under law, as if I was under law, that those under law I might gain. But he doesn't say as if. He says, to those under law, as under law, that those under law I might gain. And then in verse 21, to those without law, as without law. So Paul is telling us here that he had to go as if he was without law when he was in those nations. Now, if it was so true that Christianity, or if you want to go that way, that Paul specifically taught that the law is gone, why would Paul have to say, I went as if there's no law when I was amongst people without law? You see, verse 21 wouldn't even say this, to those without law, as without law. If there is no law to start with. You see what I mean? Paul wouldn't be saying this. The reason that Paul said this, after all that buildup, is to show us that there is a law. That's why he says right here, he says, to those without law, as without law, bracket, not being without law to God, but within law to Christ. So how could anybody say that we're not under law? And he said he did this that I might gain those without law. Same format as I came to Jews as a Jew, that I might gain them. I came to those on blah, 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 blah. Right? So quite clearly, the law is in effect. Not only from that clincher part there where, he says, as without law, but he directly says it right after, the next words. Not being without law to God, but within law to Christ. So that affirms two things. It says that he's within law to God, and he's within law to Christ. So you tell me, how could it be that Paul taught the law is gone? Right? And not to mention all the other verses that he said, the other 30-something, right? But ignoring them for now, just focus on this. How could anybody believe that Paul taught that the law was gone? Right? It's ridiculous. Now, this is what I mean where I said I'd do a few minutes of explaining the confusion that people have, that Christians and churches have with the law. Because the average Christian, 97% of all Christians, right? Most Christians don't get studious. Right? And if they study, they go to Bible study, read a page or two every week, right? I'm talking about people who are really studious. That's just roughly speak, probably 10%. You know what I mean? If you have a class of 30 kids, which one's going to be a brainiac? You know what I mean? You're only going to have a few brainiacs in the class. That's the point, right? So the average Christian, the 90% of the Christians, they're just under the impression, as I was growing up as well, that there is the law, which is Judaism, and then there is Christianity, which there is no law, you're under grace. And the whole concept, there's so many different variations and denominations, but generally speaking, right, they teach that Judaism is the law, and that Christianity doesn't have that. It's just the grace, okay? And that the grace replaced the law. The law's dead, it's gone, it's abolished, it was useless, whatever. They use so many different words to describe it. They cherry pick things from the Bible to tailor their silly desires, right? They spin such a web deceiving people thinking that the law is gone. But what they don't understand is what the law means, right? The word law is actually Torah. Okay? Torah means law. That's the Hebrew word for it. There's 3 or 4 different definitions in context for the law. You could be talking about an earthly law. Ancient Greece had a law. I'm just making it up. Ancient Greece had a law where you had to be naked at the Olympics. Actually, I think that was a real law, but probably Roman, right? So that's not a God-given law. That's an earthly law. But if a Hebrew person was to talk about that law, he would say Torah, okay? This is what I mean. You have all these different, because of the word and the multiple definitions of the word, context, right? Layers of context and applicable definitions, it becomes confusing to people. So you can have earthly law, which is still called the law, the Torah in Hebrew, okay? Then you have the Torah, meaning the first, books of the Bible, right? That's literal, that's the Torah, okay? But the reason it's called the Torah is because Torah means law. So the name of the Torah just means the law, right? Now, it also symbolizes Judaism because as a religion, you're defined by your theological doctrine, okay? And its doctrine is the law. So you can call the Jewish Bible, the first books of the Jewish Bible, you can call it the Torah. So the Torah is a book, okay? Then the law, like I said, could be an earthly, mundane law. Then you could also be literally referring to the legal laws given in the book, the Torah, okay? And I think there's a fourth one, but you get my point. There's multiple different levels, right? So when Paul and other people are talking about the law in their various books of the New Testament, you have to stop and think which definition, which context is being used here. And if it's hard to understand, you have to crack it like a math problem. You have to look at evidence here, evidence there, and then figure out what is the obvious context is being used in. And that'll help you understand what definition it is. Okay? Now, if the disciples are going to talk to Jews and talk about the law of God, they're referring to the Jewish law, i.e. Judaism. Like in Matthew 5, where Jesus says the law is eternal. It won't go away till the heaven and the earth go away. Right? But if you're to speak to the Gentiles, they're not under Jewish law, right? I'm not going to start that debate again, but they're not. According to the Bible, they are not under Jewish law. They're under Gentile law, right? So if you turn to a Gentile and you say, oh, you have to keep God's law, it's not talking about you keep Judaism. It's not talking about that you have to you have to keep the Jewish law. You know what I mean? It's talking about you have to keep the law that God expects of you, which means Gentile law. The whole world was under Gentile law until Moses. With Moses, the Sinai law, which is what the Jewish law is, the Sinai law, it came to those at that little mountain Sinai. It did not come to the rest of the planet. Okay, so you really have to understand when somebody is talking about the law in the New Testament, who are they speaking to? Are they speaking to Jews? Are they speaking to Gentiles? Are they speaking to a mixed crowd? If you're speaking to Jews and you say you must keep the law, it means you must keep the Torah, the Jewish law. If he's speaking to a Gentile and he says you must keep the law, he's talking about you must keep the Gentile law. If he's talking to a mixed crowd and he says you must keep the law, he's saying to what pertains to who. Because no matter what group you want to call it, it's a law from God. You see my point? So that's the that's the complexity of the word Torah, the law. Okay? And that's where the churches have gotten so confused, because they see these verses that appear to say the law is dead and gone, or whatever it might say, and they automatically think, oh, Judaism is dead and gone. Some churches teach that the Old Testament shouldn't even be read. It's dead and gone. You know what I mean? There's all different wacky beliefs, but at the end of the day, they believe either the books are dead and gone, that the Jewish law is dead and gone. You know what I mean? There's different ways to look at it. Judaism is dead and gone, but the fact of the matter is, Jesus said in Matthew 5, it's eternal. It didn't magically change later with Paul. That's coming from the mouths of confused people. Paul affirms the law, like we just read here, right? Not being without law to God, but within law to Christ. That's two affirmations. He's under Christ's law and under God's law. Boom. Right? And elsewhere where Paul says, neither did I commit any offense in the religion of the Jews, whatever it was, he says, where is it? I'll go find it. This is a one verse video. Paul. Not law Jews. I think I find it like that. No. Anyways, it's a one verse video. It's going to take too much time to bring that up, right? There's a time he's defending himself before the Roman tribunal. And he says, I never offended in the Roman laws. I never offended in the Jewish law. And the reason he said that is not because the Jews ruled Rome. He said it because he was a Jew, like he professed. And as a Jewish, follower of Jesus Messiah, he knew that from Matthew 5, he had to keep the Jewish law. That's why throughout all Paul's books, he's doing all the Jewish rituals, right? And festivals and this and that there, because he's bound to keep the Jewish law as a Jew, right? That's why all the Jewish disciples didn't want to preach to the nations, because how could they spread Judaism? And then Peter had to be rebuked, saying, and he had to be given a vision from Jesus, don't forsake the Gentiles. You have to accept the Gentiles in, right? They're part of the fold now. You have to accept, if they turn their heart to God, you have to accept them in. When they come in, they're not getting the Sinai law. They get the law that the whole earth has by default. From Adam, at Adam's creation was when having a mind blank there, the Gentile laws, right? At the creation of Adam in Eden was given the Gentile laws, that you shall not kill. Originally, Eden had no killing, because that was maybe the first command offhand. I'm just thinking it was probably the first one. Thou shalt not kill. If I'm not mistaken, Adam, or earlier on a little bit later, but early on in Genesis, we're also told, do not eat blood or drink blood, right? So we have these first things commanded. Then we have the acts of perversity or whoredom being condemned with the early sons, like with Noah and various other early patriarchs. The Gentile laws are made very clear early on, but obviously God's not going to be lacking foresight. He obviously told all the logical laws to Adam. He didn't just let him loose in a jungle and say, do whatever you want. He obviously sat down and told him, hey, you got to be nice. Don't hurt people. Don't do wrong to others. Be a nice person. Be happy. You know what I mean? Respect me. Respect everybody else. God obviously said that. Those are the Gentile laws that every human is bound to, whether they realize it or like it or not. That's what we're bound to. That's what every patriarch and person of the Bible was judged by under God until Moses. And even after Moses. The only people that it differs with is after Moses, those descended from the Hebrews present at Sinai are bound to keep the Sinai law. Why? Because it was a contract of obligation that if they were to be redeemed from their slavery in Egypt, that they would have to keep this law. That's the only reason why. And like I said in my recent video, the nations were never enslaved in Egypt. We didn't have to plead to God through an intermediary to be redeemed from a slavery. Okay? I'm not saying that we didn't have to, but we didn't. And the Bible doesn't say we did. Right? It says it of the Hebrews. Okay, so everybody has to factor all that stuff in. But the video's been long enough. Right? That verse, 1 Corinthians 9, okay, start at verse 14 or earlier if you want, is very, very clear that the law is in effect. Okay, so do not go around saying that Judaism is dead and gone. You're calling Jesus a liar. Do not go around saying that you shouldn't read the Torah books of the Bible. Jesus quoted the Torah books of the Bible. Okay? If he didn't quote them specifically, he reinforced and quoted and loved and promoted more, that's the best word, he promoted, okay, all of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. Alright, so don't say Judaism is dead and gone. Don't say that the first books are dead and gone. Don't say that the Jewish law or that the law of God is gone. However you want to look at it, there is law. And to each their own is the law that you've been given. You know what I mean, right? There is law, and we're under law. And Paul himself says later, the famous Antichrist verse in Thessalonians, he says that this nasty, bad guy, he never actually calls him Antichrist, by the way, but he says this man of sin is the man of lawlessness. And Paul has many verses where he demonizes lawlessness. And you know, none of these Christians who believe the law is dead and gone, none of them stop to think. I mean, all of them believe the law is dead and gone. And the Antichrist is the man of lawlessness. Right? They never stop to think, well, okay, so the big bad guy wasn't even named as Antichrist, but the man of sin, who we believe is the Antichrist, he is the Antichrist, according to Thessalonians there. One of the reasons he is because he's a man of lawlessness. Lawlessness, stop and think about it, means you're not under law. There's no law. It's lawless. So all those Christians who are out there thinking there is no law, you're being lawless. You're under lawlessness. Right? If I type in the word lawless, how many times does that occur in the New Testament out of interest? 17 times. Yeah, let's just read them. This looks good. Matthew 7:23. Then I will acknowledge to them that I never knew you. Depart from me, ye who are working lawlessness. Well, gee, why would Jesus say that if we're not under law? Right? Matthew 23:28. So also ye outwardly indeed do appear to men righteous, like you squeaky clean Christians, and within ye are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Right? Don't sound too good for being lawless. Right? That's good enough for this video. It's meant to be a one verse video. Anyways, folks, digest this. It's important. You're under law. Go learn. If you're not Jewish, then you're under Gentile law. Right? If you want to know what Gentile law includes, okay, specific, it's the two laws that Jesus gave the rest of the world. To all the non-Jews, Jesus gave the first two laws. Why? Because the first two laws, which are from Judaism, these first two laws, as Jesus put it, summarize every other law that could come from God. So if you want to be righteous to God, all you got to do is worry about those two. Don't worry about how many thousands it could be broken down into. But Acts 15, Acts 21 also point out to clarify to people, because maybe some people thought animals didn't matter, or sexual immorality, sexual things were in a different category. So like hurting animals or oppressing animals and sexual things, maybe people thought that was a gray area. So Acts 15 and Acts 21 point out 4 of the 7 Gentile, from Genesis and all that, the 7 Gentile laws, which are don't eat from a living creature, because back then a lot of people did that. They thought animals were dumb, soulless creatures, and they would eat, rip a limb off the animal, cut the leg off, and leave the animal alive for a few days so that the meat would stay fresh, because they didn't have fridges, right? So God made that law saying you cannot eat from a living animal, and also don't eat living animals, obviously, right? And also don't drink blood. because the spirit is bound within the blood. Right? These are specific things that had to be laid out because a lot of nations did that. So it had to be pointed out for them. And don't commit whoredom. Right? Because a lot of nations thought, oh, sexuality is a part of godness and this and that there, but they're thinking sexual promiscuity, fornication, which is forbidden by God. Right? God intends man and woman to come together as one. You can't do that having multiple partners, fornicating, doing this and that there. When you fornicate and have sex before marriage, you're defiling another man's wife. Right? You're just looking forward in time, but that girl is another man's wife. Right? So, I mean, there's lots of different things, but that's what we're under. Even if, well, no. Yeah, I think if you're Jewish, you have to keep the Jewish law. You can't just keep the Gentile laws. But, theoretically, like I just said, even if you're Jewish, you could fulfill, because Jesus said it, and it's logical, you could fulfill all the laws and all the silly sounding laws of Judaism. You could fulfill them all by keeping the first two. Love God, love everybody else. Right? Because half of those 600, I've read every one of the 613 laws, right? The mitzvah. Like, I can't remember the exact proportion, like 1/3 or 1/2 roughly, maybe even more, maybe 2/3, but let's just round it off. Let's just say half. Half of them were only for the priests and certain people of temple rank, right? So it was only like 200 or 300 out of the 613 that are actually applicable to every Jewish person. And it might even be less than that. Okay? And a lot of those laws you needed a temple in order to do, because a lot of those laws were temple-based rituals. And without a temple, you cannot do them. And the Tanakh teaches you're not expected to do them. Okay? And that whole concept of, well, if there's no temple, how do you keep all the laws that you need to keep? Well, any rabbi will tell you, oh, well, God says in this book here in the Old Testament that, you don't need a temple. You don't have to keep all these laws. You got to... What's it all come down to? It comes down to the Gentile law. Just be righteous. You know what I mean? That's what it comes down to. That's why Jesus said the whole law and the prophets can be surmised as this one, love, right? Love God and love everybody else. That's why you don't need to have it broken down into 500, 600, 6,000. Doesn't matter. You could break it down to infinity. There's no point. One day not one day. It took longer than that. One time I sat down and I wrote down, it took probably weeks or months, every virtue that I could think of, because I wanted to try and practice expressing each and every virtue. I literally got my list to 1,000. When I got to like 800, I was like, I could keep going. I identified 1,000 different virtues. You see what I mean? You break it all down and make that 1,000 laws. You must be courageous. You must be hopeful. You must be ambitious. And all this and that there. You see what I mean? Or you could just have one. Be righteous. Right? Or as Jesus put it, be loving. Right? But be righteous. Anyways, gotta go. It's not even half an hour. That's not too bad. But anyways, it's still too long for this video. I've got to go pick up some food. So anyways, God bless, folks. Take care.